My parents skipped my surgery for a vacation. Grandpa walked in. I remember the exact sound the hospital gown made when I tied it behind my back, because my hands were shaking too hard to get the knot right the first time. It was a small sound, a soft rustle of paper-thin fabric, but in that quiet pre-op room it felt as loud as a scream. I was 34 years old, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed at 6 in the morning, waiting for a surgery that carried real risk, and I was alone. Not alone in the sense that no one loved me. Alone in the sense that mattered most right then. No one who was supposed to be there had shown up. The surgery wasn't minor. A mass had been found near my kidney during a routine scan, and the surgeon had used words like, "We won't know until we're in there," and, "There's a chance we'll need to remove more tissue than expected." I had spent 3 weeks lying awake at night turning those sentences over in my mind, trying to make them smaller than they were. I had called my mother the day I got the diagnosis. I remember exactly what she said, because I've replayed it so many times since that it's carved into me like a groove in a record. She said, "Oh honey, that's scary. Keep us posted. Keep us posted." Like I was updating her on a delayed flight. I told myself she was in shock. I told myself my father just didn't know what to say because he never did. I told myself that when the date was set, the actual date, the one that mattered, they would be there, sitting in that waiting room with the bad coffee and the flickering fluorescent lights, the way parents are supposed to be. I was wrong. 2 days before my surgery, I got a text from my mother. Not a call. A text, sent at 9:42 in the morning, while I was on the phone with my insurance company trying to sort out a coding error that could have cost me $4,000 I didn't have. The text said, "Hi sweetheart, quick update. Your dad and I are heading to Cabo with Melissa and the kids for a week. We booked it months ago and honestly we need this after the year we've had. Sending you all our love and positive vibes for Thursday. You've got this." 2 exclamation points. For my kidney surgery. Melissa is my younger sister. She is 31, she has 2 children who my parents talk about the way other people talk about winning the lottery, and she has never, in her entire life, had to ask twice for anything. If Melissa sneezed, my mother would call 3 specialists. If I told her I might lose a kidney, she went to Cabo. I sat there on my kitchen floor. I don't even remember sliding down onto it, I just remember suddenly being on the floor with my phone in my lap, and I read that text maybe 15 times. I kept waiting for it to say something different. It never did. I didn't cry, not right away. What I felt first was something colder than sadness. It was the feeling of finally seeing something you'd spent your whole life refusing to see. Because if I'm honest with you, this wasn't new. This was just the loudest, clearest version of something that had been happening quietly for 34 years. And I think that's the part that broke something in me, not the vacation itself but the confirmation. The moment the pattern stopped being deniable. I called my husband, Ethan, and he came home from work early and just held me on that kitchen floor for a long time without saying anything because he already knew. He'd watched this pattern from the outside for 8 years of marriage, and he'd learned a long time ago that there was nothing he could say that would fix what my parents were. So 2 days later I checked myself into the hospital with my husband by my side, and that was supposed to be enough. And it almost was. Except that morning, sitting on that bed with my hands shaking over the tie of my gown, a nurse popped her head in and said, "Your grandfather is here. Should I send him back?" I hadn't even called my grandfather. I want you to understand something about my grandfather, because he is the reason this story doesn't end where you think it might. His name is Walter, and he is 81 years old, and he built a modest hardware supply business from nothing after coming home from the army with barely a high school diploma. He is not a warm man in the traditional sense. He doesn't hug easily. He doesn't say "I love you" the way people do in movies. But he shows up. He has always shown up. And somehow, even though I hadn't told him the date, even though I'd specifically decided not to worry him with it because he'd had his own health scares that year, he was standing in the doorway of my pre-op room in a gray flannel shirt, holding a paper cup of coffee he clearly wasn't going to drink, just so his hands would have something to do. "How did you know?" I asked him, and my voice cracked in a way I hated. He said, "Your mother mentioned it. Weeks ago. Before she apparently forgot." That sentence sat in the air between us for a long moment. I watched something pass across his face. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to recognition. Like a man confirming a suspicion he'd been carrying for a long time, and had hoped he was wrong about. He pulled a chair up next to my bed, sat down heavily the way older men do, and he took my hand. His hands were rough and cool. And I remember thinking that this was the first time in weeks anyone had touched me like I mattered. "They're in Mexico," I said. I don't know why I told him. Maybe I needed someone else to know, so the injustice of it would exist outside my own head. Grandpa Walter didn't say anything cruel about my parents. He never does, not directly, that's not his style. He just nodded slowly and he said, "I see." And then he said, "Well, I'm here. That'll have to do." It did more than have to do. It undid something in me that I didn't know needed undoing. The surgery took 4 hours. Ethan told me later that Grandpa Walter didn't leave the waiting room once, not even to eat, and when the surgeon finally came out to say it had gone well, they'd managed to preserve most of the kidney, the mass was benign, I would recover fully. My grandfather had apparently shaken the surgeon's hand with both of his and said thank you for separate times, which Ethan said was the most emotional he had ever seen the man in 20 years of knowing him. When I woke up in recovery, groggy and nauseous and disoriented, the first face I saw was his. He was sitting in the corner of the room with his reading glasses low on his nose, doing the crossword from a folded newspaper, like he had nowhere else in the world to be. And when he saw my eyes open, he set the paper down immediately and came to the bed and he said, "There she is. I want to tell you that was the end of it." That I recovered, my parents came home from Cabo sunburned and apologetic, and everything healed the way surgical incisions heal, slowly but completely. But that's not what happened. What happened is that this moment, this specific injustice, cracked something open in my grandfather that had apparently been building for a long time. And what came out of that crack changed everything. Because it turns out my grandfather had been watching my parents for years. Quietly. The way people watch things they love slowly go wrong, hoping they're imagining it, hoping it will correct itself. And my hospital room was where he stopped hoping. I didn't know any of this yet. All I knew in the days after my surgery, lying on my couch at home with a body pillow wedged against my incision and a bell my husband had given me so I wouldn't have to shout for help, was that my parents had texted me exactly twice from Mexico. Once to ask how the surgery went, for hours after I'd already texted the family group chat that I was out and stable, and once to send me a photo of a sunset with the caption, "Wish you were here, feel better soon." I stared at that photo for a long time. The sky was this obscene, gorgeous orange streaked with purple, the kind of sunset people pay thousands of dollars to see. And I thought about the fluorescent lights of the pre-op room, and the rustle of that paper gown, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as quiet, cold clarity. My parents came home a week later. My mother called me the day they landed, breathless and cheerful, asking how I was feeling, telling me about the resort, about how Melissa's kids had loved the pool, about a margarita she'd had that she was still thinking about. She talked for 11 minutes before she asked to see my scar over video call, and even then it felt like an afterthought, like she was checking a box. I didn't yell at her. I want you to understand that about me. I have never been someone who yells, who makes scenes, who says the sharp thing in the heat of the moment. I was raised in a house where the loudest voice always got listened to, and Melissa had always been the loud one, so I learned early that being quiet was the only kind of power I had. I just said, "It was hard doing it without you there." And my mother said, "Oh, sweetheart, I know, but Grandpa was there, right? That's what matters." And she said it so easily, so smoothly, like a door closing, that I understood in that moment she had already decided this wasn't going to be a problem. She had decided it before she even landed. That was the mystery that started eating at me. Not just why they'd chosen the vacation, vacations get booked, plans get made, I understood scheduling conflicts. What ate at me was how easy it was for her. How practiced that deflection sounded, like she'd used a version of it before. Grandpa was there, right? That's what matters. As if my grandfather's presence was a convenient patch that absolved her of anything, as if she'd built a whole internal system for explaining away the gaps she left in my life, a system so smooth it didn't even require effort anymore. I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before. Small things. The way every family event for the last decade had somehow orbited around Melissa's schedule. The way my college graduation had been attended by my parents for exactly 40 minutes because they had to get back for Melissa's sorority formal photos. The way my wedding toast from my father had been, word for word, almost identical to a toast he'd given at a cousin's wedding 2 years earlier. I'd found the video once, late at night, and I'd never told anyone I'd found it, because some part of me didn't want to know what that meant. I didn't go looking for more. Not at first. I was recovering, physically and otherwise, and I told myself that dwelling on this pattern would only make me bitter, and bitterness wasn't a place I wanted to live. But then about 3 weeks after my surgery, my grandfather came to visit, and he brought a manila folder with him, and he set it on my kitchen table and he said, "I think it's time you saw some things." That folder was where the real story started. Grandpa Walter is a meticulous man. He kept records the way some people keep diaries, not out of suspicion originally but out of habit, a lifetime of running a small business teaching him to document everything. What he showed me that afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with a pot of tea going cold between us, was a set of bank statements going back almost 6 years. He explained it slowly, the way he explains everything, like he was worried about upsetting a structure that was still settling. Years earlier, after my grandmother passed away, my grandfather had set up what he called a family support account. A fund meant to be split evenly between me and Melissa when we each hit certain life milestones. A wedding, first home, a medical emergency if one ever came up. He had never announced this fund loudly. He told my parents about it, expecting them to pass the information along, or to help manage the disbursements fairly when the time came, because he trusted them, because they were his son and daughter-in-law, and because at 81, he didn't want to be the one handling every transaction himself. What he'd discovered, going back through his own bank's year-end summaries after a call from his financial advisor about some inconsistent activity, was that disbursements had been made from that account. Several of them. All of them to Melissa, or for things clearly related to Melissa, a down payment supplement, a nursery renovation, and 3 weeks before my surgery, a $5,000 transfer that landed in my parents' joint account 4 days before they booked a Cabo vacation package for 6 people. I sat very still while he explained this. I remember the tea going from steam to stillness in my cup. I remember the low hum of my refrigerator, the only sound in the kitchen besides his voice. "They used my money," I said slowly, "to fund the trip they took instead of my surgery." Grandpa Walter didn't flinch from the word used. He nodded once. "That's what it looks like. I want to be fair. I don't have proof of intent. Money's fungible. They'll say it went into a general account and the trip came from savings. But the timing." He tapped the paper. "The timing is what it is. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage, not the way you'd expect. It was something quieter and much worse. It was the specific sick feeling of realizing that a lifetime of small hurts had never actually been random. That there had been a structure underneath it the whole time. A scaffolding of favoritism that I had spent 34 years trying not to see, because seeing it meant admitting my parents had made a choice over and over, and the choice was never me. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked him, and it came out smaller than I meant it to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I kept thinking I was wrong. Every time I told myself I was an old man reading too much into things. Your grandmother used to say I saw conspiracies in coincidences." He looked down at the folder. "I don't think I was wrong." That night, after Grandpa Walter left, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I did something I had never done before in my life. I started actually organizing the evidence methodically, the way you build a case rather than nurse a wound. I am, by profession, a paralegal. I had spent 11 years helping lawyers construct arguments out of scattered documents, and it occurred to me, sitting there at 1 in the morning with my incision still tender under my shirt, that I had never once thought to apply that skill to my own family. I started with the group chat. I went back through years of messages, and I began screenshotting anything that showed a pattern. My mother canceling plans with me to attend Melissa's events, my father's repeated, "We'll make the next one" texts that were never followed up on. The birthday my parents missed because Melissa's daughter had a dance recital the same weekend, an event they had known about for a full year, and somehow only remembered when it directly conflicted with mine. I found the message where my mother had asked me, 2 years earlier, to loan Melissa $800, just until she gets back on her feet. A loan I never saw repaid and never brought up again because I didn't want to be the difficult one. I found the message where I'd offered to help pay for my parents' anniversary dinner and my mother had said, "Oh, don't worry about it, Melissa's already got it covered." Except Melissa hadn't covered it. I'd found the receipt, months later, tucked in among old emails, showing the dinner had been paid for using a credit card in my father's name. None of these things were dramatic on their own. That's what made it so hard to see for so long. It wasn't one betrayal. It was 1,000 small deferrals, 1,000 tiny moments where I was quietly moved to the back of the line, so gradual and so consistent that by the time I was 34, I had simply absorbed it as the shape of my life. The version of me that existed in my parents' house had always been the reliable one, the low-maintenance one, the one who didn't need tending because she'd learned, early and thoroughly, not to ask for it. But Grandpa Walter's folder was different from all of that. Grandpa Walter's folder had numbers. And numbers don't get explained away as easily as feelings do. Over the next 2 weeks, while I was still supposed to be resting, I dug deeper than I probably should have. I called my grandfather's bank, with his permission and his account information in hand, and requested formal statements going back further, 8 years instead of 6. What I found expanded the picture in a way that made my stomach turn. The family support account hadn't just quietly funded Melissa's life. It had, on 3 separate occasions, been drawn on to cover what the transaction memos vaguely called family expenses, each time in amounts between $2,000 and $4,000, each time in the weeks surrounding some hardship of mine that my parents had known about and chosen not to show up for. My divorce filing fees years before I met Ethan, when I'd had to represent myself because I couldn't afford a lawyer and my parents had told me they were stretched thin. A month I'd spent unemployed after a company layoff, when my mother had told me gently that they just didn't have anything extra to give right now. Both times it turned out money from that account had moved, just never to me. I brought all of this to my grandfather on a Sunday afternoon, laid out in a binder with tabs, because some habits from work don't turn off just because the case is personal. He read through it slowly, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, his jaw tightening in a way I'd rarely seen. When he finished, he closed the binder, set it on the table, and was quiet for a long time. "I gave them that account to take care of both of you," he finally said. "Not to take care of one of you at the expense of the other." "What are you going to do?" I asked. And this is the part where I need you to understand something about my grandfather, because it's the reason this story ends the way it does. He didn't call my parents and scream at them. He didn't cut them off dramatically or show up at their door with the binder in hand, demanding answers. My grandfather does not believe in loud reckonings. He believes quietly and stubbornly in fairness, the kind that doesn't need an audience. "I'm going to fix it," he said, "properly. And I'm going to let the truth do the talking, when the time is right." What he did next took almost 2 months, and I only found out about most of it after the fact because he handled it with the same careful precision he handles everything. His will, his hardware ledgers, the model train set he'd been building in his garage since 1987. He met with his estate lawyer, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Diane Ferreira. Different Diane, no relation to my mother, though the irony of the name wasn't lost on either of us, and he restructured his entire estate plan. The family support account, the one that had been quietly bled dry, was closed and replaced with 2 entirely separate trusts, one in my name and one in Melissa's, each with its own independent trustee, each requiring dual signatures from the trustee and the beneficiary for any withdrawal. No more funneling. No more family expenses. My trust specifically was seated not just with what remained of the original account, but with an amount equal to what Grandpa Walter calculated, conservatively, had been diverted from me over the years. He called it restitution, in a tone that made clear he considered the matter a closed accounting question rather than an emotional one, even though we both knew it was both. He also did something else, something I didn't find out about until much later, and something that changed the entire shape of what came next. He asked his lawyer to draft a letter, not a legal document, just a personal one, written in his own voice, explaining exactly why the estate had been restructured. He asked that the letter be read aloud at the same time the new trust documents were formally presented to the family, at a dinner he was already planning to host for what he called a small update on some paperwork. He told my parents it was about simplifying his estate before he got too old to remember where anything is. My mother, on the phone with him, apparently laughed and said that was probably wise, and asked no further questions. She had no idea what was coming. Neither did my father. And neither, notably, did Melissa. I want to pause here and tell you what those 2 months felt like from my side because they weren't easy ones. My parents, in the aftermath of the surgery, had settled comfortably back into the rhythm of pretending nothing significant had happened. My mother called every week or two, cheerful and light, asking about my recovery in the tone of someone checking off a box on a list. She never once said the words, "I'm sorry we weren't there." Not once. My father, true to form, said even less. A text here and there, a "glad you're doing better, kiddo," as if I'd had a bad cold rather than surgery on an organ. Melissa, for her part, reached out exactly once a week after I got home from the hospital with a text that said, "Heard you're doing better. Let me know if you need anything, we're just swamped with the kids right now. You know how it is." I did not, in fact, know how it was having no children of my own, but I understood the subtext well enough. It meant, don't expect anything from me either. I carried all of this quietly. I went to work, I recovered physically. I let my incision heal into a thin silver line I still touch sometimes without meaning to. A small reminder stitched into my own skin of the week nobody came. And underneath all of it, I waited because Grandpa Walter had asked me to trust him, and in 81 years, he had never once given me a reason not to. The dinner happened on a Saturday evening in early October. Grandpa Walter hosted it at his house, the same house he'd lived in since before my mother married into the family, the same dining room where every major holiday of my childhood had happened, with the same heavy oak table that had a small burn mark near one end from a candle incident in 1994 that nobody ever fully explained. He'd asked everyone to come, my parents, Melissa and her husband Ethan and me, under the pretense of some paperwork updates and a nice meal, nothing to worry about. I remember the drive there. Ethan held my hand the whole way, and neither of us said much, because there wasn't much to say that wouldn't have sounded like nervous rehearsal. I didn't know exactly what my grandfather was going to say. I only knew the shape of it, the broad strokes, and I knew that whatever happened, I wasn't going to be the one raising my voice. Dinner started ordinarily enough. My mother brought a store-bought pie and made a joke about not having time to bake because of the chaos of the week. My father talked at length about a golf outing. Melissa's kids ran around the living room while the adults ate, and for a while it felt like every other family dinner I'd sat through my whole life, pleasant on the surface, humming faintly underneath with things nobody said. Grandpa Walter waited until the plates were mostly cleared. Then he set down his napkin, cleared his throat in that particular way he has that makes a room go quiet without him ever raising his voice, and said, "I want to talk about some changes I've made to my estate." My mother smiled, relaxed, expecting nothing more than a boring recitation of paperwork. "Of course, Dad. Whatever you need." He reached into a leather folio beside his chair and pulled out several sets of stapled documents, handing one to each adult at the table. Then he pulled out one more piece of paper, the letter, and put on his reading glasses. "Before you look at those," he said, "I want to read you something." I watched my mother's face as he began reading. I watched it shift slowly from polite attentiveness to something tighter, something more careful, as he described calmly, without a single raised syllable, the family support account he had set up after my grandmother's passing. He described its purpose. He described in specific unemotional detail the pattern of withdrawals over 8 years. He read out dates. He read out amounts. And then he read the sentence that made the room go completely silent, the sentence that I will remember for the rest of my life. $5,000 was withdrawn from that account 4 days before you booked a trip to Cabo. The same week your daughter had surgery she went through without either of you present. My mother's face went the color of the tablecloth. My father set down his fork very slowly, the way people do when they're trying to buy themselves a few extra seconds to think. Melissa, across the table, looked genuinely confused, glancing between our parents like she was trying to catch up to a conversation that had started before she arrived, which in a way it had started years before any of us were sitting at that table. "Dad," my mother started, her voice pitched high and fast, "that account was for family things we never—" "I know what the account was for," Grandpa Walter said, still calm, still quiet. "I set it up. I know exactly what it was for. It was for both of my granddaughters equally. Not for one of them exclusively, and not for vacations. We were going to talk to you about. You didn't have to talk to me about anything," he said. "It was never a secret that needed managing. It was a fund for my grandchildren, and I trusted you to handle it fairly. That trust was misplaced. I've corrected it." He explained then, calmly and without embellishment, what he had done, the closure of the old account, the 2 new trusts, the dual signature requirement that meant no single person could ever again quietly move money without both the trustee and the beneficiary knowing. He explained that mine had been seeded with an amount equal to what he'd calculated had been diverted from me. He explained that this wasn't punishment, in his words, it was correction. A ledger being balanced. He said it the way you describe fixing an error in a spreadsheet, which in a way was exactly what it was to him. I watched my mother's face throughout all of this, and I want to tell you because it mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened that night, that she did not apologize. Not right away. What she did instead was look at me, really look at me, for the first time in longer than I could remember, and something crossed her face that I can only describe as the particular horror of being seen clearly by someone you assumed had stopped looking closely a long time ago. "Claire," she said, and her voice had lost all of its earlier brightness, "I didn't realize you knew about any of this." "I didn't," I said quietly. "Grandpa found it. I just helped him confirm it." My father, to his credit, was the first to say the word sorry, though even then it came out sideways, wrapped in justification. "We didn't think of it that way at the time. Melissa needed help more often, that's all. It wasn't ever a decision against you." "It was a decision," I said, and my voice was steady, steadier than I expected it to be, because I had spent 2 months preparing for this moment without fully admitting to myself that I was preparing for it. "Every time you chose her, you were choosing not to choose me. That's still a choice, even if you never said it out loud." Melissa, to her credit, didn't defend our parents. She sat very still, staring down at the documents in front of her, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear, I didn't know where any of that money was coming from. I just thought," she stopped. "I don't know what I thought. I believed her mostly. Melissa had been the golden child her entire life, but I don't think she'd ever had to ask the uncomfortable question of where the gold was coming from. That's the particular privilege of being favored. You rarely have to look too closely at the mechanics of it. Nobody yelled that night. Nobody threw anything, nobody stormed out, nobody said anything that couldn't be taken back the next morning. It was, in its own strange way, one of the quietest confrontations I've ever witnessed, and also one of the most devastating, because the silence in that room said more than shouting ever could have. My mother cried, eventually, not loud, dramatic tears, but the kind that leak out when someone's carefully maintained image of themselves has just been shown to them from an angle they can't unsee. My father stared at the table for a long time before he finally looked up and said quietly, "We should have been there. At the hospital. I'm sorry, Claire. There's no excuse good enough, so I'm not going to try to give you one. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo 8 years of small deferrals or one very large absence. But it was the first honest thing either of my parents had said to me in longer than I could remember, and something in my chest loosened slightly when I heard it, not because it fixed anything but because it was true. Grandpa Walter didn't gloat. That's not who he is." When the documents had been reviewed, when the room had settled into something quieter and sadder than it had started, he simply said, "I love all of you. That's why I did this. Fairness isn't punishment. It's just fairness." And then, in a moment that undid me more than anything else that night, he reached over and put his hand on top of mine, the same way he had in the pre-op room months earlier, and said, "You didn't deserve to spend your whole life being the easy one. Easy isn't the same as unimportant." I cried then, finally, quietly, in a way I hadn't let myself cry in the hospital or in the weeks after or in any of the thousand small moments over the years when I'd swallowed the hurt instead of naming it. Ethan's hand found mine under the table. And for the first time in longer than I could say, I felt like the scales in my own family had been set right, not through revenge, not through anger, but through the simple, devastating power of the truth being spoken plainly, in a quiet room, by someone who had loved fairly enough to notice when fairness had gone missing. In the months that followed, things didn't magically transform into some perfect version of family harmony. My mother and I are still rebuilding something that was cracked for a very long time, and I've learned that trust, once withdrawn, comes back slowly and in small installments, much like the trust fund Grandpa Walter set up for me now requires. My father has become unexpectedly more present than he ever was. He calls now, actual calls, not texts, and he asks real questions and waits for real answers. Melissa and I had a long, difficult, necessary conversation over coffee about the ways our parents had shaped us both. Her into someone who never had to ask, me into someone who never learned how, And something between us that had been quietly resentful for years finally started to soften into something more honest. My relationship with my grandfather is different now too, though it was always close. There's a particular kind of love that exists between people who have witnessed each other be quietly wronged and quietly stood by one another anyway. And that's what we have now, deeper than it was before. Forged in a pre-op room and a manila folder and a dining room table with a burn mark from 1994. I think about that hospital gown sometimes, the sound it made when I tied it with shaking hands. Alone in a room I shouldn't have been alone in. I think about the sunset photo, that obscene gorgeous orange sky, sent to me like an apology that wasn't one. And I think about my grandfather standing in that doorway in his gray flannel shirt, holding coffee he never drank, saying, "I'm here, that'll have to do," in a voice that, at the time, I thought was simply kind. I understand now that it was more than kindness. It was the beginning of justice, quiet and patient and utterly without malice, the kind that doesn't announce itself with anger but simply waits, gathers what it needs, and sets things right when the moment is ready. My parents skipped my surgery for a vacation, and my grandfather walked in, not just into that hospital room, but into the quiet architecture of my entire family, and he didn't tear it down. He simply carefully rebuilt it so that it could finally hold all of us fairly. That, I've learned, is what real vindication looks like. Not shouting. Not revenge dressed up as justice. Just the truth laid out plainly on a table, in the hands of someone who loved you enough to notice you've been missing from the picture all along.